she found herself trapped in a relationship that was threatening her personal safety. Skylar had grown up in a Christian home with parents who loved and respected each other, but when she was 19 years old, she entered into a relationship with a guy from work who was 8 years older than her. She says slowly over time, when you're building a relationship with somebody who's much older than you are and they really flatter you, they really make you feel like you're the most important person in the room, that they really value your opinion and you value their opinion. You want to be around people who seem to value you. They had already been friends, and so it seemed like a friendship was a good foundation for a romantic relationship. But even as Skylar learned that he was involved with other women during their relationship, he would always reassure her that she was the most important thing to him. Yet, they didn't go public with their relationship. She says, he didn't act like I was his partner or his girlfriend. That went on for a really long period of time, maybe up to year 4. I didn't really notice it at the time. I couldn't pinpoint anything specifically that I thought was super manipulative, and he had an explanation for everything. For example, he always needed to know where she was, but because he wasn't controlling things like what she wore, she didn't see it for what it was. She says, it always sounded endearing, like he really cares about my day. He cares about what I'm doing. He cares about where I'm going. He cares about who I'm with. These apparent concerns, though, led to more controlling behavior on his part. He drove Skylar and her best friend apart, not even allowing them to speak. She said, I had to cut off that friendship, which was absolutely devastating. Right out of the gate, we were in a power dynamic situation that I was not even aware of. Feeling more and more isolated, she sought out a counselor who recommended a book about narcissism. Once I started to see it, she says, I couldn't unsee it. I started paying attention to the things that were happening in the conversations that we were having. Following this, Skylar confided in her pastor. She showed him the texts and the emails from her boyfriend. He said to me, Skylar, this is abuse. Her boyfriend then started getting physical. First, he held her arm tightly, and then she found herself shoved against a wall. And then she was held by her neck against the wall. That was the moment, she says, in the end, where I was like, this person might be able to kill me. After each of their breakups, he would come back, making promises, making her feel important. She would believe it would get better, but it never did. Because she had never witnessed abuse or trauma in her own home growing up, she didn't foresee either of these in her future relationships. She recalls thinking, for people who come from good, stable households, how could you ever end up in abuse? Abuse seemed like something that happened to other people, but would never happen to me. She found herself trapped in a relationship that was threatening her physical safety. But every time she tried to get out, she found herself pulled right back in. The pain of ending things was a steep price to pay. She had a dream of a future that she was going to have to lose, and there was always the hope that things could change. Over the last few months, we have been looking at how to disagree beautifully. When you have to disagree, when your perspective is different, how can you do it in a way that rather than being life-taking and threatening is actually life-giving and encouraging, actually filled with love and respect and beauty? Today, we're going to look at a passage that makes a counterpoint. Sometimes, this is how we're going to end the series, because sometimes after you have disagreed beautifully and respectfully on your part, after you've gone to great lengths to try to love a person and to work with them, whether it's a business relationship, a family relationship, a work colleague, a romantic relationship, or a friendship, sometimes the most loving option is to end a relationship. And it's incredibly hard. But knowing this is part of our learning to discern God's will for us. So we're going to look at a passage in which St. Paul addresses the 25% of the Roman and Greek population who was enslaved, specifically Christians who were slaves, enslaved persons who followed Christ but were the property of another. This is 1 Corinthians 7, beginning in verse 21. Were you a slave when you were called? That is, when you became a Christian. Don't let it trouble you. Although, if you can gain your freedom, do so. For he who was a slave when he was called by the Lord is the Lord's freedman. Similarly, he who was a freeman when he was called is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. What do we see here? First, God is telling us that sometimes ending a relationship is the most loving, godly, wise, and respectful choice to make. Sometimes we need to know when to walk away. This is clear biblical instruction. Were you a slave when you were called? If you can gain your freedom, do so. He's saying, get out. God is telling us that sometimes ending a relationship is the most loving, God-honoring option and the most aligned with God's plan for human flourishing. So in a sermon series about disagreeing beautifully, where we hope to model a life-giving manner of disagreement, not ugly but beautiful, we have to realize that sometimes we need to know when to walk away. If you can gain your freedom, do so. What did it mean to be a slave in antiquity? Let's get some context here. In Greece and Rome, about 25% of the population was enslaved. Slavery was not race-based as it was later on in North America. You ended up in slavery because you were captured as a prisoner of war, or you ended up in slavery because you were a victim of piracy, somebody stole you, or you sold yourself into slavery in order to retire your debts. Or if your mother was a slave, you could be born a slave. A slave in Greece and Rome was the property of their master. As such, being a slave made you susceptible to your master's wishes, whether good or evil. He might treat you well, or he might whip you, or torture you, or violate or degrade you in any number of ways. Slavery was the worst of the work relationships. Sometimes slaves were placed in better arrangements, like a Greek slave that might be the tutor to the household children, training them in Greek language and literature and culture. Or a slave might be given management over a household or over a business. But for every one that had the good slave jobs, there were many more who were either forced to serve underground in mines or in agriculture. And in such cases, they could be treated quite harshly and worked very long, very painful hours with no days off. In ancient Israel, by contrast to the Greek and Roman world and really the pagan world around it, the Hebrew Old Testament had forbidden the enslavement of Jewish people, and kidnapping for slavery was specifically punishable by capital punishment, the death penalty. Exodus 21. Anyone who kidnaps another and sells him must be put to death. A Jewish person could enter into an indentured servitude to pay off a debt, but that service ended automatically after 7 years. He only became a permanent slave if he chose to at that time. And even then, it was his labor that was owned, not his person, not his soul. This was designed to prevent the permanent inherited enslavement of people within Israel. After a servant had finished their term of labor in Israel, their master was required to send them away with provisions of livestock, grain, and wine, so that they would not end up impoverished again and have to sell themselves again into 7 years of servitude. Foreign prisoners of war were sometimes held as slaves in Israel, and such slaves had far fewer protections than Jewish servants. Foreigners could be your property, though the master could not murder them. There were some protections for slaves, as we read earlier in Exodus 21. If a man hits his slave in the eye and destroys it, he must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. And if he knocks out the tooth of his slave, he must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. In other words, while you owned the slave's labor, you did not own their person, and if you injured their body, they would have to be set free. As such, the law of Moses had regulated and restrained slavery in contrast to how it had been practiced among Israel's neighbors, and it forbade it among fellow Israelites. But according to the Hebrew Bible, also runaway slaves from a pagan country, from a far-off land, if they came to Israel, the Israelites were forbidden from sending them back home where they would again be enslaved. Rather, they were to harbor them as a refuge. And so, being a slave in antiquity was difficult. Slaves could own property, and there were ways to buy your freedom, but it wasn't easy. In antiquity, to be a slave was really hard if your master was Jewish, and it was a death sentence if your master was a Gentile. Were you a slave when you were called? If you can gain your freedom, do so. See, being a slave was never easy, and God is telling us sometimes ending a relationship is the most God-honoring, loving thing to do and most in line with God's design for human flourishing. Sometimes you got to know when to walk away. See, slavery was a relationship that had never been God's design for human flourishing. Paul says, do not become slaves of men. It's not God's will. The New Testament describes the slave trade as ungodly and sinful. In 1 Timothy 1, we read, we know that God's law is made not for the righteous, but for lawbreakers and rebels, the ungodly, sinful, for slave traders, and for whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine. God's design for human beings is that we bear his image. We therefore have dominion over creation as co-kings and co-queens with God himself ruling over creation. We are designed to be moral free agents who image God through the choices we make and the things that we pursue. We were never intended to be enslaved in the beginning. And so while the New Testament does instruct Christians who find themselves enslaved to be respectful of their masters in order to win them to Christ, it also says, if you can get out, get out. Were you a slave when you were called? If you can gain your freedom, do so. God is telling us that sometimes ending a relationship is the most loving, God-honoring choice. Sometimes we got to know when to walk away. So, second question, your second thing to notice. We have to ask the question, if sometimes the best thing to do is to end a relationship, whether that's with an employer, an employee, a family member, a parent, a coworker, a friend, a church, a denomination, when do you know? If sometimes it's the most loving option, how do you know when you might be called to end a relationship? Certainly, if you're being held in servitude as a slave, if somebody's treating you like property, God says if you can gain your freedom, do so. Word about terminology. Many of you are Americans, and when Americans hear the word relationship, they usually hear one thing: romantic relationship. People sometimes ask me, Greg, are you in a relationship? I'm in hundreds of them with people I love dearly. But relationships can be many different things. So when you hear me say relationship, don't hear romantic relationship. I'm talking about all kinds of relationships, including the romantic ones, but also all the other relationships that you might find yourself in. This is a sermon about any relationship and when the most loving option is to leave it. Similarly, understand there may be reasons, even when you have good biblical reasons to end a relationship, you might also have good biblical reasons to just suffer in that relationship because of some greater good that you think God might be calling you to do. And so just the fact that you can leave an unhealthy relationship doesn't mean you necessarily have to, though Paul does tell slaves, if you can gain your freedom, do so. When might ending a relationship be the most loving option? Just doing a cursory survey of the Bible, I've figured out at least 5. Obviously, one example is if you're being held in servitude against your will, get out. Another one you see, for example, in Joseph's relationship in the Old Testament with Potiphar at the end of the book of Genesis, where Joseph is an absolutely faithful, loyal servant, but when continuing in that will require him to be seduced by his boss's wife, that's a bridge too far, and so he takes actions that will inevitably end the relationship and lead him to jail. Because if you're being pressured to sin in a relationship, that might be a good indication that that's not a healthy relationship. You see Abraham and Lot in Genesis going separate ways for good reason. You see Abigail, basically abandoning her marriage to Nabal, whose name means fool, because Nabal is standing up against the Lord and his people and their appointed King David. And she is not going to stand at his side while he defies the holy and righteous God. And so she goes over to David's side, and her husband ends up dead. You see Rahab breaking her relationship with her own people in order to identify with the people of the Lord. You see the Hebrew midwives who were otherwise called to obey Pharaoh as their king, then disregard that relationship and say, that relationship is not in play here because you're asking us to kill children, and we're not going to sin against God for the sake of honoring Pharaoh. You see Paul and Barnabas in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, going their separate ways because they just can't work with each other. You see David, who was looking to Saul not only as his father-in-law but his mentor, then having to change that relationship and avoid him because his own safety was at risk. You see Elisha, the Old Testament prophet, ending his relationship with his servant Gehazi because Gehazi was using the ministry to enrich himself, and Elisha could not allow the ministry of the Lord to be tainted in that way by greed. You see Jesus telling people that if your spouse is cheating on you, you can walk away from that. You're not bound by that. Adultery effectively ends a marriage, and so you're free at that point to make a choice if you want to stay or if you want to leave. Paul in 1 Corinthians talks about that same thing in the case of abandonment. When you've got a spouse who has abandoned their marriage, it's not wrong for you to acknowledge that they've already ended the marriage and to walk away. It's not a question of who files for divorce. That's irrelevant. It's who has broken the marriage. And so there are all these reasons in Scripture to end a relationship. What can we conclude just by looking at these biblical examples? If we were to try to draw some general guidelines about when the best option may be to leave a relationship or to radically change it, when do you need to walk away? I think we can draw some principles. If the cost of staying in a relationship is that you have to sin against God, then you need to get out of that relationship because the Lord is not in it, and you cannot bow down to that person as if they're God and come to the Lord. You have to end it if the price is your rebellion against God, because nobody is worth that. The Lord is everything. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off, Jesus says, using hyperbole to make the point that God is the most beautiful thing out there. And if you want to live a life in pursuit of beauty, you will find it in Jesus. And if somebody's saying you have to choose between me and Jesus, you need to say bye. This is the case with Joseph and Potiphar. If you can gain your freedom, do so. If the cost of staying in a relationship, whether it's a business relationship, a romantic relationship, a friendship, or a family relationship, is that you must be personally degraded, for example, as a slave, or as a spouse that's being cheated on, or being abandoned, if the price of the relationship is your personal degradation, it might be better for you to walk away. If you can gain your freedom, do so. If the cost of staying in a relationship is serious harm to yourself or others, like David, his own life was at risk, or the Hebrew midwives who were being asked to hurt somebody else's life. If the cost of staying in a relationship is harm to yourself or others, it might be wise for you to consider whether that relationship needs to continue. If the cost of staying in a relationship is your relationship with God's people must be put at a distance, that's something very close to the Lord's heart. With Elisha, with Abigail, with Rahab, they had a choice. They could either identify, with God's people and end the relationship with their own, or they could keep that and not have a relationship with the people of God. If the cost of a relationship is abandoning your relationship with God's people, he might be calling you to walk away from that. Similarly, if the cost of a relationship is abandoning God's mission, then he may be calling you to walk away from a relationship. That was the case with Paul and Barnabas. That was the case with Elijah and his servant Gehazi. These are 5 reasons that I think the Bible gives us positive reasons that this may be God telling you to walk away from this relationship, whether it's business, whether it's church, whether it's friendship, whether it's family member. These 5 reasons. If the cost of the relationship is that you must sin against God, be personally degraded, experience harm yourself or cause harm to another, abandon God's mission, or lose your relationship with God's people, then, and this is not an exhaustive list, this is just what I could think of looking through my Bible. When the relationship costs any of those things, the most loving option may be to end the relationship. It may not be as well. Like all of these passages, it requires discernment and weighing what else God might say somewhere else, what other options there might be, getting godly counsel and for people who love you and who love the Lord, and praying about it and making discerning choices. I know a handful of marriages that have survived an affair and gone on to truly thrive and glorify God because the perpetrator repented and God redeemed it, and the victimized spouse chose to forgive even though they had the freedom to walk away. So just the fact that it might be best doesn't necessarily mean it is. You have to see what God wants you to do, and no one else can tell you what that is. Now, sometimes ending a relationship is really hard, even if it's a bad relationship. Our identity tends to get wrapped up in things like career and coworkers and the people we go to church with and the family members and who we're in a romantic partnership with. Our identity gets so wrapped up in our relationships. And when you build your career with a business partner who is toxic, and you then have to disentangle your business from their business when it was one business, that's really hard. Disentangling 2 careers, that won't be easy. When you have to put distance between you and a toxic family member, it's not easy. You will face feelings of false guilt that are not from the Lord, they're your conscience. You may second guess yourself constantly. You may feel like a failure. You may face pressure from other family members who don't like the way that you're drawing a boundary that must be drawn. You might experience a grieving process, grieving the relationship that you ought to have had and always wanted to have, but is no longer possible because of decisions the other person is making. That's hard. And when you go through a romantic breakup, even when the relationship was bad, it can still really hurt because you're grieving the loss of a future you thought you would have. And you're afraid of whether you're going to end up being alone. And the longer you were with somebody, the bigger hole that's left and the greater the sorrow that fills it. Loss of even a bad relationship means loss. And then there are all the practical challenges that are too many to name. And when we can struggle with the fear of being alone, struggle to imagine what life may look like on the other side, struggle to figure out how we're going to rebuild our business or start over after losing everything. We may question whether God is really going to meet us on the other side, whether he'll walk with us through it, or whether we're going to be alone. And so when you've tried and tried and tried to disagree beautifully, but the cost of relationship, the demands of that relationship will take you from your obedience to God, your communion with his people, the mission he has for you, or if it'll cost you or someone else serious harm or personal degradation, that God is telling us sometimes ending a relationship is the most loving, God-honoring option. Even when it's hard, sometimes you need to know when to walk away. If you can gain your freedom, Paul writes, do so. So, if that's how difficult it is, then how is it possible when you draw the conclusion that God is telling you to make a very painful choice to end a relationship? How is it possible? And I think sometimes we just need to hear God telling us to get out. If you can gain your freedom, do so. For the first century Christian who found themselves enslaved, those are incredibly gracious words, because they might be thinking, oh, but I would dishonor my master. They may not come to the Lord if I'm not the perfect slave for them. Maybe I can influence them. And they say, no, just if you can gain your freedom, do so. It's very gracious for him to tell us to do something, because some of us are by nature more prone than others to stick with things and to try one more time to make it work out, whether it's out of a sense of personal loyalty or out of an unhealthy need to be needed, out of a sense of personal guilt or shame learned early in life, an unhelpful sense that we just don't matter. There are all sorts of reasons why some of us find it very difficult to pull the trigger and end something that's not from the Lord. And if that's you, there may be times in your life where you just need to hear God speaking to you saying, if you can gain your freedom, I want you to do so. And when you know you need to walk away, whether from a family member, a business associate, a friendship, whatever, there is an emphasis in this passage on something that can help you, can help us. And it's this: even when you lose everything, your business, your stability, your home, your partner, your future, your dreams, when all of that is gone, your most fundamental relationship is still absolutely secure. He who was a slave when he was called by the Lord is the Lord's freed man. You have been supernaturally united to Christ if you believe in him, if you are following him. You have been supernaturally united to Jesus, and in him you now have a freedom to take risk, a freedom to obey what he says, a freedom to follow his leading into the great unknown, the freedom, if necessary, to lose everything, knowing that you're still safe and secure in the hands of a God who will never leave you, never forsake you, who will walk with you through the fire and bring you to glory on the other side. Galatians 5, Paul writes, "It is for freedom's sake that Christ set you free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery." Jesus says in John 8, if the Son of God sets you free, you will be free indeed. To be the Lord's freed person, a free person belonging to Christ, is to know that God has your back, that the Father is your dad. He set his eyes on you. He sees you. He sees what you're going through. He's leading you. He's calling you. He will walk with you. He will not leave you alone, and he will be with you when you pick up the pieces and help you rebuild, and what you will have at the end will be so much better than the thing that had enslaved you. And so you can throw all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. Our ultimate relationship is absolutely safe, and no one can take that from us because you belong to him now. In 1 Corinthians 6, Paul wrote, "You were bought at a price." And that means that you are the Lord's treasured possession. No one is going to snatch you out of his hands. Your ultimate relationship with God is absolutely safe and secure, and that is a strong foundation, a strong platform that you can stand on. And when the flood comes and wipes everything and everyone else away, you will stand because you have built your house on the rock of Jesus and his gospel, his grace, and the fact that in him you are secure. Remember, Christ himself became a slave so that you can walk about in the freedom of the children of God. We read in Philippians 2 of Christ Jesus, who being in the very nature God, made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a slave. Our English translations try to clean it up and say, of a servant. Oh, that's so nice. A servant makes minimum wage and can walk away. A slave is in bondage. Jesus didn't become a servant. He became a slave, a doulos, being made in human likeness and being found in appearance as man, Paul writes. He humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. And therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave Jesus the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Jesus, who was the very form of God, the morphe of God, Jesus, who was the very image and form of eternal God, became a slave in order that we, who were enslaved to our own sin, might be set free to follow him and walk with him and serve him in the glorious freedom of the children of God. God the Son enslaved himself to purchase your freedom and mine. That, friends, is what love looks like. That's a God who dies for us even when we were his enemies in order to make us his friends. That's a God who loves you enough to see you through a painful separation and a painful loss. A God who is strong enough in order to take care of you and good enough to care and to do so. He will walk with you through the tears and the texts and the second guessing and the losses. That is a God who is wild about you and who will strengthen you and comfort you and defend you because he purchased you to live in freedom. Therapists have identified 4 distinct phases to one of the more common cycles of abuse. Tension, when things are getting tense in the room. The incident, when things blow up. The reconciliation and calm that some call the honeymoon after the blow up. Most abuse victims, whether men or women, suffer through multiple cycles of abuse before they ever decide to get out. For Skylar, it took 10 cycles over many years. She says, I couldn't see the power dynamic. I couldn't see the manipulation. I couldn't see any of that until it was shown to me. And just God placed individual people in my life like at the perfect time. When Skylar finally left that relationship, she surrounded herself with people who loved her and walked with her, including her best friend who she had previously cut off as the price of the relationship. She says, I think revealing the truth to people you trust is really important. That's what brought some of the freedom. And then when you taste a little bit of the freedom, you want more of it. Even though Skylar saw through the lie that the relationship and abuse were her fault, she still found herself dealing with layered, complex grief. She says, I invested myself in a relationship that was going nowhere. It meant a lot of grieving for the future you thought you were going to have together. Skylar recognizes the importance of therapy and the continual work needed to heal from her trauma. But more than anything, leaving the abusive relationship helped Skylar rediscover her relationship with Jesus. She says, it changed the way I saw the compassion of Jesus. It changed the way I saw the rage of Jesus, his anger, to believe that he would have been angry that I was treated the way I was treated. And it changed the way I understood the justice of what God is like. It came from being healed by the love of Jesus and believing that he died to set me free from that. Once you've gone through something like that, you can't read the Bible the same way as you did before. And the more that I read the Bible, he is who he really says he is. When he says he is a healer, he can and will